The technician locked the shop door, turned his back to the street sign outside, and whispered a sentence that made the blood in Ethan Cole's veins turn cold. Cancel the engagement today, and change the locks before nightfall. That morning had begun like any other in Seattle, gray, damp, and quiet enough to make life seem as if it were moving along the right track. Ethan stood in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled up, making coffee for two. Olivia Grant, his fiancée, was tying her hair in front of the mirror, getting ready for work. She kissed his cheek, that familiar gentle smile on her face. A woman who looked to anyone watching completely safe. The silver laptop rested on the kitchen table, its screen flickering strangely. Olivia sighed and said it had been acting up since the night before that her work data was important. Ethan nodded and said he would take it in to be fixed. His voice was calm. In Olivia's eyes, he was always that kind of man. Stable, predictable, someone who did not ask too many questions. Before leaving, she added one small request. Just make sure they do not look through my personal files. Ethan smiled, reassured her, picked up the laptop, and headed to his car. He did not know that this was the last time he would leave his house as a man preparing for marriage. The repair shop sat on an old street corner, wedged between a laundromat and a small bakery. Inside, the familiar smell of metal and electronic dust hung in the air. The technician Marcus, in his 40s, sharp-eyed and quiet, greeted him. Ethan had brought machines here before. Their relationship was casual but trusted. Marcus powered on the laptop and ran a few basic checks. Then he stopped. His brow tightened. The silence stretched longer than normal. Ethan asked if something was wrong. Marcus did not answer. He stood up, walked to the front door, and turned the lock. The metallic click echoed sharply in the small space. When Marcus turned back, his voice dropped as if afraid someone might hear. I need to show you something. But first, you need to promise me you will not react impulsively. A vague pressure settled on Ethan's chest. He nodded. Marcus opened a hidden folder. Not work images, not design files. Photographs. Dozens of them. Ethan sleeping in his bed. Ethan sitting in his home office. Ethan opening drawers, signing documents, talking on the phone. Shots taken from a distance, from low angles. Timestamps stretching across many months. Ethan's hands went cold. What is this? Marcus swallowed. My diagnostic software recovered deleted files. Usually it is family photos. But this is systematic. Very intentional. He opened another folder. Audio recordings. File names labeled by date. Ethan's own voice filled the room, talking about work, about assets, about what his father had left him after his death. Ethan did not remember when he had sunk into the chair. In his mind, the image of Olivia tying her hair in the mirror that morning rose up. Gentle. Calm. Without a single crack. Marcus continued slow and precise. The metadata shows everything was recorded using this laptop, this camera, this microphone. You mean Olivia. Marcus did not say her name, but he nodded. In that moment, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. The man everyone thought was ordinary and predictable was being monitored like a target, not because he was weak, but because someone believed he did not understand what he truly possessed. Marcus placed his hand on the counter and looked directly at him. I have seen this before. It never ends well if the person being watched does not realize they are already part of the game. Ethan stood up. His back straightened. The shock drained from his face, replaced by a quiet stillness. Inside him, one door had just closed, and another had opened. He thanked Marcus, took the laptop, and stepped back onto the street. Seattle remained gray. People hurried past unaware. No one knew that inside Ethan's mind, a truth was rearranging his entire life. The woman he was about to marry was not just hiding something. She was playing a role. And from that moment on, Ethan made a decision. If this was a game, then he would no longer be the man everyone underestimated. Ethan did not go straight home. He drove in circles through the city, as if stopping too soon would make everything he had just seen become irreversible. Seattle rain fell lightly, streaking across the windshield in blurred lines. Traffic lights changed slowly, red to green, green to red, mirroring the rhythm of his heartbeat. In Ethan's mind, the images would not fade. Him sleeping, him working, him living inside his own home, while somewhere always there had been eyes watching. He pulled over to the side of the road, shut off the engine, and rested both hands on the steering wheel. For the first time since adulthood, Ethan felt exposed. Not physically, but in the most private parts of his life. Every thought he believed was safe. Every conversation shared over dinner could have already been turned into data. He thought of Olivia. That morning she had stood in front of the mirror, tying her hair neatly, asking if he remembered their plans for the weekend. Her voice had been gentle, her eyes perfectly calm. Ethan remembered every detail now, because every memory had taken on a new meaning. He began to wonder when her questions about his work, his long-term plans, his finances had stopped being simple concern. Ethan started the car again and headed home. On the drive, he made a critical decision. He would not confront her. He would not ask questions. He would not reveal a single sign that he knew the truth. If this was a performance, then he would become the most patient audience member, waiting until the entire stage was flooded with light. When Ethan opened the front door, the familiar space greeted him with a false sense of calm. Olivia was not home yet. He set the laptop down on the kitchen counter and looked at it as if it were a foreign object, an ordinary machine, yet also a gateway into a carefully constructed surveillance. He did not turn it on. He did not touch it again. Ethan walked through each room, the living room, the bedroom, the home office. Everything appeared unchanged, yet the feeling was different. He paused in front of the bookshelf where he kept his father's important documents. He did not open it. He did not need to. He already knew someone else might have stood there before looking at the same place, but with an entirely different purpose. That evening, Olivia came home at her usual time. She walked in smiling and asked how his day had been. Ethan answered briefly, saying work was fine. He kissed her forehead, a familiar gesture, but inside every movement was tightly controlled. They ate dinner together. Olivia talked about the office, about co-workers, about a new project. Ethan listened and nodded at the right moments, but for the first time he was not carried by the conversation. He observed the way she placed her phone face down on the table, the slight pause whenever he mentioned money. Details he had never noticed before now stood out with sharp clarity. After dinner, Olivia sat on the sofa and opened her own laptop, saying she needed to finish some work. Ethan went into the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back looked ordinary. No sign of power, no sense of threat. And that was exactly what made him the perfect target. But Olivia did not know one thing. Ethan's father had taught him that real power is not what others see, but what they never expect. The preparations made long before. The boundaries no one is allowed to cross. That night, Ethan lay beside Olivia, listening to her steady breathing. He wondered how many times she had looked at him like this before, while thinking something entirely different. How many nights his unguarded words had been recorded, stored, categorized. He did not fall asleep right away. In the darkness, Ethan began reorganizing everything in his mind, not through emotion, but through logic. Who benefited? Who stood to lose? Who was behind it all? And most importantly, why they believed he was not dangerous enough to notice. By the time Ethan closed his eyes, he was no longer the man who had walked out of the repair shop in shock. He was entering a new phase, one where silence would become a weapon and patience would become a shield. And Olivia, without knowing it yet, was already moving closer to the moment when her performance would no longer have an audience willing to believe it. Ethan realized his house was no longer a place of shelter. It was a scene that had never been sealed, and the most frightening part was not that someone had entered, but that he had no idea how long they had been standing there. The next morning, Ethan left the bed earlier than usual. Olivia was still asleep, turned away from him, her breathing steady, her face so peaceful, it almost made him want to blame himself for doubting her. But Ethan no longer allowed himself that comfort. He moved quietly out of the room and closed the door behind him, as if stepping away from a space filled with hidden explosives. In the kitchen, he made coffee as he always did. The smell was familiar, but it no longer brought a sense of safety. He sat at the table and looked around a home that had once been his private life. Every wall, every corner, each one could have witnessed moments he believed belonged only to the two of them. Ethan began checking things carefully, not rushing, not tearing anything apart. He observed with the eyes of someone who had accepted that he was inside a dangerous game. In the home office, he noticed something small, yet enough to make his heart beat faster. The laptop charger had been moved. Not much, not obvious. But to Ethan, it was a signal. He knelt down and looked beneath the desk. A small black object was attached tightly to the wooden frame. A recording device. Not large, not easy to spot, but undeniably there. Ethan removed it and held it in his hand. No shaking, no panic. Only a cold sensation running along his spine. This device had not appeared overnight. It required time, planning, familiarity with this space. He sat back down, placed the device on the desk, and stared at it, as if looking directly at someone who had crossed the final boundary. In that moment, Ethan understood that Olivia had not merely been gathering information through casual conversations. She had turned this house into a surveillance system. The sound of a door opening behind him made him turn. Olivia stood there, her hair slightly messy, wearing her sleep shirt, asking what he was doing. Her voice was light, unguarded. Ethan covered the device with his palm, stood up and smiled. He said he was looking for an old set of documents. Olivia nodded and walked into the kitchen to pour water. Not a single extra glance, not the slightest unusual reaction. That natural ease was what made it terrifying. Throughout the day, Ethan played the role of a more ordinary man than ever. He went to work, attended meetings, answered emails. No one noticed that in his mind, every detail was being reorganized. He no longer asked why. He began asking who benefited. At midday, sitting alone in his car, Ethan called Daniel Brooks, the family lawyer who had handled matters related to his father's estate. After listening, Daniel was silent for a long time, then said a sentence that confirmed Ethan had stepped into a much darker place. If there are recordings inside the house, this is no longer personal betrayal. This is a file being built. Daniel warned Ethan not to act emotionally, not to remove all devices, not to confront anyone. Because if a file existed, then the person behind it would not be only Olivia. There had to be someone else, someone with enough motive to turn affection into a tool. Ethan thought of his father of the trust fund of the documents he rarely spoke about. He had believed discretion was enough. Now he understood that discretion sometimes leads others to underestimate you. That afternoon, Ethan came home earlier than usual. Olivia was surprised and asked if something was wrong. Ethan said work was lighter. She smiled without suspicion. They ate dinner, watched a familiar program. Everything looked exactly as it had before the truth surfaced. But inside, Ethan, a new map was being drawn. He began noting the moments Olivia stepped out to take calls, the way she placed her phone, the way she asked seemingly harmless questions about his schedule. When night fell, Ethan lay beside Olivia, staring at the dark ceiling. He no longer felt the sharp pain of the first day. His emotions had shifted into something else, clarity and a firm resolve. If someone believed he was just an ordinary man easy to control, they had made a serious mistake. Ethan did not need to raise his voice to reclaim power. He only needed to stay silent long enough to see the entire picture. He discovered the truth on what seemed like an ordinary evening when a casual question from her caused the air in the room to freeze. Ethan did not react immediately. He stayed silent, letting a tired smile linger on his face, as if he were still the underestimated man, the one who only went to work, came home, and trusted the woman beside him. But inside another door had opened the door of clarity. Olivia's question was gentle, carefully framed. She asked about an old investment of his father, something Ethan had almost never mentioned since his father passed away. She asked like a future wife, concerned about their shared future, her voice soft, her eyes warm. But Ethan heard something else. She was not asking to understand. She was asking to confirm. He answered briefly, deliberately, vague. Olivia nodded and did not press further. That withdrawal was what made it frightening. She already had the answer she needed, or at least she believed she did. That night after Olivia fell asleep, Ethan sat alone in the living room, the yellow light casting long shadows on the cold floor. He no longer searched for recording devices. He knew they were there. He knew it clearly. And he also knew that from this moment on, every word he spoke could become a weapon in someone else's hands. The next morning, Ethan changed his routine. Not abruptly, not in a way that drew attention. He began coming home later, blaming work. He started taking private calls in his car. He appeared tired, distracted. Everything was intentional. He wanted to see how Olivia would react when the data stopped being complete. Olivia grew tense. She asked more questions, but maintained her familiar, gentle demeanor. She talked about the wedding, about long-term plans, about merging finances after marriage. Each sentence was wrapped in affection, but Ethan clearly saw the rushed stitching beneath the surface. Somewhere else, another woman was waiting. Margaret. The name returned to Ethan's mind like an old wound suddenly bleeding again. His ex-wife gone for years, leaving behind bitterness and disputes that never truly faded. Ethan had believed it was over. Now the pieces were fitting together in a disturbing way. He met Daniel, the family lawyer, at a small cafe. The meeting looked like two old friends talking, but every word was measured. Daniel did not ask much. He only confirmed one thing. If someone wanted to reopen the past, they would need evidence. And if there was evidence, it would have to be gathered from inside. Ethan understood. The woman beside him was not just betraying him. She was working. That evening, Olivia brought home a bottle of wine, saying she wanted to celebrate good news at work. She smiled more than usual, was more attentive, more affectionate. Ethan watched every movement, the way she placed her phone face down on the table, the way she left the room when messages arrived, the way she avoided his eyes when money was mentioned. When she went to the bathroom, Ethan stood up and walked very slowly to her handbag. He did not rummage through it. He only looked, and he saw it. A business card slid out from a small pocket. A law office, another city. Not where Olivia worked. His heart did not race. It beat steadily, cold, clear. He put everything back exactly as it was and returned to his seat before Olivia came out. She kept smiling, kept talking about the future, kept playing the role of a woman in love. But from that moment on, Ethan knew one thing for certain. This game did not begin with love. It began with interest. And what they did not know was that Ethan had never been just an ordinary man. He stayed silent, not because he was weak. He stayed silent because he was waiting. Waiting for them to grow confident. Waiting for them to go too far. Waiting for the moment when the masks would fall completely. That night, lying beside Olivia, listening to her breathing, Ethan felt no more pain, only resolve. If they believed he was prey, they would soon learn. This prey knew exactly where he stood, and he was ready to overturn the board. He knew he had crossed a point of no return the moment Olivia's phone vibrated in the middle of the night, and she slipped out of bed without offering an explanation. Ethan did not open his eyes right away. He kept his breathing steady, pretending to sleep, letting her silhouette disappear behind the bathroom door. The water did not run, only the light turned on, and then a voice lowered and restrained broke into short, hurried fragments. Each syllable pierced the silence like a needle. Ethan did not need to hear the words clearly. He understood. Some calls only exist when a person believes they are not being watched. When Olivia returned, she placed her phone face down on the nightstand. A familiar motion. A habit of someone who had done this long enough to forget that habits can also become evidence. Ethan turned slightly, feigning a shift in his sleep. Olivia lay down, pressed close, her hand resting on his chest, like a mark of possession. Gentle. Precisely calculated. The next morning, Ethan left the house earlier than usual. No goodbye, no kiss, no explanation. Olivia watched him go, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing her eyes, before her expression settled back into calm. She did not ask questions. She did not need to. She was tracking. Ethan drove to the office but did not go inside. He sat in the car watching people pass by like meaningless figures. Then he called Daniel. Not to ask questions, but to confirm. Daniel listened and said only one thing. If you want to know what kind of file they are building, you need to let them believe you are still the man they think you are. Ethan ended the call and took a deep breath. He was used to being underestimated, used to dismissive looks, used to people thinking he was just a lucky heir who understood neither law nor power. They were wrong, and their greatest mistake was giving him time. That afternoon, Ethan came home on time. He cooked dinner, took the initiative, normal to the point of perfection. Olivia was surprised. She smiled. She asked questions. She talked about work. Ethan listened, nodded, asked the right things at the right moments. He showed her a tired, predictable man, unguarded. The man she believed she fully controlled. After dinner, Olivia received a call. She stood up and said she would step onto the balcony for some quiet. Ethan did not stop her. He cleaned the dishes slowly, counting her footsteps through the glass. When the sliding door closed, he placed the towel on the table. Enough. He walked into his study and opened the bottom drawer. He was not looking for documents. He took out a small, thin, silent device, a gift Daniel had given him the week before. Ethan slipped it into his pocket, adjusted its position, then returned to the sofa as if he had never left. The call ended. Olivia came back inside, looking more relaxed. She sat beside him, rested her head on his shoulder, whispered that she loved him. Ethan did not answer right away. A deliberate pause. Then he said it back, his voice warm enough, convincing enough. She smiled. She believed him. That night when Olivia slept deeply, Ethan did not sleep. He listened to what the device had captured. Not much, but enough. One name repeated, another city, a law office, and finally a voice he recognized instantly, even after many years. Margaret. Everything fell into place like a complete picture. No more doubt. No more theories. The woman beside him was not just betraying him. She had been hired. She was collecting. She was constructing a narrative in which Ethan was a man who concealed, deceived, and deserved to be exposed. He turned off the device and sat in the darkness. No anger, no panic. Only cold clarity. They believed he knew nothing about his father's legacy, nothing about how trusts were built, nothing about why the clauses were written the way they were. They were wrong. His father had not only left him money, he had left him a fortress. The next morning, Ethan kissed Olivia before leaving for work. She smiled, reassured. She did not know that from that moment on, every word she spoke, every step she took, was being recorded, not to attack, but to end everything. Ethan stepped outside, sunlight washing over his calm face. The game had entered a new phase, and this time he was the one writing the rules. Everything shattered, not with an explosion, but with a smile that was far too perfect. That morning, Olivia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her hair, and casually asked Ethan about putting a joint account under both their names after marriage. Her voice was light, her eyes calm, but it was precisely that smoothness that made Ethan understand they had entered the final stage. When the prey no longer struggles, the hunter begins to tighten the rope. Ethan answered evenly. He said the lawyer would handle that after the wedding. Olivia nodded, showing no objection, no disappointment. She had already obtained what she needed, not the answer itself, but the reaction, or rather the lack of it. After Olivia left the house, Ethan did not go to work. He drove to an old office complex on the edge of the city, where Daniel had arranged to meet. No sign, no receptionist, no cameras in the lobby. Just a small room with frosted glass, and a man accustomed to dealing with things that should never exist on official paperwork. Ethan placed the recording device on the table. Daniel did not turn it on immediately. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, as if evaluating not the situation, but the man sitting in front of him. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Do you know why they still have not acted?" Ethan shook his head. "Because they think you know nothing, and because they need one more step, one mistake from you." The words slid into place like the final piece of a puzzle. Ethan understood. All the questions about accounts, shared assets, timing of the marriage were never about preparing for a future together. They were meant to push him into signing something, an agreement, an email, a recorded statement. One slip would be enough. Daniel turned on the device. Olivia's voice filled the room, clear and decisive. This was not the gentle woman from home. This was someone reporting progress. Margaret's name came up repeatedly. Another lawyer's name followed, and then one sentence made Ethan's hand tighten. "He trusts me. Just one more step." Daniel turned the device off. The air grew heavy. Ethan felt no anger, no shock, only a cold sensation running down his spine, not because of betrayal, but because he realized that in their eyes, he had never been a person, only a file nearing completion. Daniel leaned forward. "Now you choose. Keep playing the man who knows nothing, and wait for them to expose themselves, or strike now, but it must be precise. One time. No mistakes." Ethan chose the first path, not out of fear, but because he understood that real power does not come from revealing your hand too early. It comes from controlling the moment. In the days that followed, Ethan became the perfect version of himself in Olivia's eyes. He spoke about the future, about family plans, about leaving work earlier to spend more time with his wife. Olivia observed, documented, reported. She began to relax, to believe everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Meanwhile, Ethan quietly reorganized his life. He moved important documents out of the house, changed passwords, updated legal clauses his father had prepared years earlier. Things that once seemed outdated now became armor. One evening, Olivia suddenly suggested inviting Margaret to a small dinner, saying she had run into her by chance and wanted to close the past in a civil way. The proposal was delivered delicately, like a final test. Ethan agreed. In that instant, Olivia froze, only for a fraction of a second. But Ethan saw it. It was the moment she had not anticipated. In their script, he would hesitate, avoid, react emotionally. But he did not. That night, while Olivia slept, Ethan sat alone in his study, looking at an old photograph of his father, a man who had foreseen everything, even the greed of those called family. Ethan lightly touched the frame. He said nothing, but inside, He was ready. The meeting would happen. The masks would fall, and this time not through rage, but through truth. Ethan was no longer the one being watched. He was the one leading them exactly where he wanted them to go. The meeting happened sooner than expected, and it began with a handshake that froze the air in the room. Margaret stepped into Ethan's house with the confidence of someone who believed she held the advantage. She wore a dark coat, the familiar perfume of the past trailing behind her, carrying an entire marriage that had long since rotted. Olivia walked beside her, gentle and composed, like a perfect bridge between two people who once shared a bed but now stood on opposite sides. Ethan watched them calmly, as if this were nothing more than a polite social dinner. Inside, however, every beat of his heart was counting down. The meal unfolded slowly, painfully slow. Margaret spoke at length about old memories, about difficult years, about how things might have turned out differently if they had understood each other better back then. Olivia listened occasionally, adding a comment, playing the role of flawless mediator. Ethan let them speak. He ate very little. He observed the way Margaret avoided direct questions, the way Olivia placed her hand on Margaret's wrist at just the right moments, like a silent signal. Then Margaret shifted the subject. She spoke of transparency, of things left unsaid in the past, of the feeling of being excluded from a part of life she believed she deserved. Her words were chosen carefully, soft on the surface, with a hidden blade beneath. Ethan set his knife and fork down. He apologized and said he needed to get more wine. Olivia started to rise to help, but he waved her off. He left the table and walked into his study, where yellow light fell across quiet walls. He opened a drawer and touched the folder he had prepared, not to read it, but to feel its weight, the weight of truth. When Ethan returned, Margaret was talking about the law, about vague clauses, about how the past could be revisited if there was enough evidence. Olivia looked up at him, eyes searching, waiting for his reaction, a trace of fear, a trace of expectation. Ethan smiled. He spoke softly, saying that he understood that he had anticipated this possibility long ago, that his father was a cautious man, and everything he left behind had a reason. Margaret hesitated just for a moment, but it was enough to reveal the confusion beneath her confidence. Ethan continued. He spoke about his father's final days, about long conversations, about the fear that greed would ruin everything. He spoke of how documents were prepared, how clauses were written to protect the future. He did not raise his voice. He did not attack. It was simply the truth peeled back layer by layer. Olivia grew tense. She shifted in her chair. Margaret set her glass down, the sound dry and sharp. Ethan looked directly at Margaret for the first time all evening. He said that some things could not be taken back by rewriting the story, and that some people had underestimated him, believing he did not understand the rules of the game. His voice remained low, but it carried something undeniable: authority. Margaret pushed back, saying the law would decide that emotions could not change facts. Ethan nodded. Agreed. Then he said the sentence that silenced the entire room. He said the law cares very much about how evidence is obtained. Olivia turned toward him, eyes wide. Margaret narrowed hers. Ethan stood and went back into the study, returning with a thin folder. He placed it on the table without opening it, leaving it there like a warning. He said that he knew. He knew about the late-night calls. He knew about the recording devices. He knew about the reports being sent. He did not name names. He did not accuse. But each word drove itself into the air like a nail. Olivia went pale. Margaret said nothing. Ethan did not need them to confess. He did not need to win in that moment. He only needed them to understand one thing. The game had shifted. Dinner ended in silence. Margaret left earlier than planned. Olivia cleared the table with slightly trembling hands. She did not dare look at him. That night, Ethan stood alone in the living room, looking at the house that had once been his refuge. He felt no emptiness. He felt clarity. The unmasking was not complete, but the foundation had collapsed. And from this moment on, none of them could pretend that Ethan did not know exactly what he was doing. The truth erupted the following morning when Ethan realized the house was terrifyingly silent. Olivia had left early. No note, no coffee cup touched, no curtains opened. The kitchen was spotless, like a stage display, cold and impersonal. Ethan stood in the middle of it, clearly sensing the shift in the air. This was no longer camouflage. This was a tactical retreat. He did not panic. He did not rush to call. He made coffee for himself, sat down and opened his phone. The message arrived quickly, as if it had been prepared in advance. Olivia said she needed time, that the dinner the night before had shaken her, that she loved him but was not sure she could handle the pressure. The words were soft, heavy with emotion, but Ethan read something else beneath them. She was creating distance. She was removing herself from the scene. He replied briefly, that he understood, that he would be there when she was ready to talk. No pleading, no interrogation. That calm response alone shifted the balance of power. At noon, Daniel called. His voice was direct. Margaret had contacted another law office, not to file immediately, but to probe to see if they still had enough evidence. Ethan listened and smiled faintly. Daniel asked if he wanted to stop. Ethan said not yet, not the time. That afternoon, Ethan went back to his office for the first time in days. Employees greeted him with familiar respect. No one knew that beneath the surface, a storm was being carefully guided. Ethan sat at his desk and opened the family financial files. Old documents clauses, once considered overly cautious, now read like a clear map. He made another call to an independent advisor his father had trusted. The conversation was brief and precise. The man confirmed everything was ready if Ethan chose to bring the truth into the open. But Ethan was not ready to end it yet. He wanted the truth to surface on its own, not be forced. That evening, Olivia returned, quietly, without eye contact. She went straight into the bedroom and closed the door. Ethan did not follow. He stayed in the living room, sitting in the dark, letting distance do its work. An hour later, Olivia came out. Her eyes were red, her voice hoarse. She said Margaret was applying pressure, that everything had gone beyond what she expected, that she did not want to continue, but did not know how to stop. Ethan listened. He did not interrupt. He showed no reaction. That was what frightened Olivia most. She said she had made a mistake, that at first she was only helping, that she never imagined things would go this far. Ethan asked only one question, whether she was still recording. Olivia fell silent. That silence was the answer. Ethan stood. He said he needed space. No raised voice, no accusations, just a decision. Olivia watched him, realizing for the first time that the man in front of her was no longer within her control. That night, Ethan did not sleep at home. He went to a small apartment he had kept for a long time, a place no one knew about. He sat alone looking out at the city through the window. No sadness, no anger, just the sense of an ending drawing near. The next morning, Margaret appeared at Daniel's office without an appointment. She demanded a conversation. Her voice was firm, her eyes no longer confident. Daniel listened, took notes, and handed her copies of documents Ethan had authorized for release. Not many, but enough to make one thing clear. The evidence had been obtained improperly. Margaret left in silence. Later that day, Olivia sent a long message. She asked to meet. She said she was ready to tell everything. Ethan read it and did not reply immediately. He knew this moment mattered, not for revenge, but for closure. He called Daniel and said it was time. That evening, Ethan returned home. The lights were on. Olivia was waiting, her face exhausted, tense, afraid. Ethan stood across from her, calm and steady, no longer the man being watched, no longer the one underestimated. The conversation was about to begin, and this time no one could hide behind a role any longer. The truth was revealed not with a shout, but with a whispered sentence that left Olivia with nowhere to hide. Ethan did not sit down when the conversation began. He stood leaning lightly against the edge of the table, creating just enough distance so he was no longer the familiar man from every evening, but not yet an enemy either. Olivia sat across from him, her hands clasped together, fingers tightening until they turned pale. The overhead light exposed the dark circles beneath her eyes. No makeup, no performance. Ethan spoke slowly. He said he had known for a long time, not since the dinner with Margaret, not since the late-night calls, but from the moment he realized the silence in his own house was no longer natural. Olivia looked up, her lips trembling. She tried to speak, but Ethan raised his hand not to command, but to ask for silence. He went through everything in order, the questions disguised as concern, the calls cut short, the subtle changes in habit. He did not accuse. He simply recounted it as if reading a report Olivia herself had helped write. Each detail landed like a stone, heavy and precise. Olivia began to cry quietly, tears streaming without drama or pleading. She said she never intended to hurt him, that at first it was only helping that Margaret had approached her before they ever met, that everything spiraled beyond control. The explanations overlapped and fractured. Ethan listened, but he did not get pulled in. He asked only one question, his voice steady, asking whether she understood what she had done. Olivia nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. She said she knew she was wrong, but she also said she had truly loved him. The room went silent. For a brief moment, Ethan felt something stir in his chest, not hope, but regret. He said that feelings do not erase actions, and that love cannot coexist with surveillance, recording, and reporting. Olivia lowered her head and whispered that she was willing to do anything to make it right. Ethan looked at her for a long time, then said the thing neither Olivia nor Margaret had anticipated. He said that all the evidence they had collected was legally worthless, not because it lacked detail, but because of how it was obtained. Illegal recordings, unauthorized collection of personal information, invasion of privacy, each one on its own, enough to backfire. Olivia snapped her head up and asked how he knew. Ethan did not answer immediately. He went into his study and returned with a folder. This time he opened it, not to threaten, but to show her. The clauses, the dates, the signatures from many years earlier. His father's legacy was not just money. It was preparation. It was foresight for the worst scenarios. Ethan said his father once taught him that if you have power, you do not need to use it early. You only need to know where it is. Olivia collapsed back into her chair. She understood. They were not winning. They were destroying themselves. Ethan said he did not want to take this to court, unless necessary, not out of pity, but because he wanted it to end properly. He gave her a choice. She could tell the full truth, everything to the lawyer recorded in writing, and cut all contact with Margaret. In return, he would not pursue criminal liability. Olivia sobbed, then nodded slowly, as if each nod cut away a piece of herself. The conversation lasted late into the night. When it ended, Olivia packed a few personal items. No arguments, no pleading. She stood at the door for a long time before leaving and said she was sorry not to be forgiven just to say it. Ethan remained alone in the brightly lit house. He did not feel victorious. He felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. The game was nearly over, but one person still had not faced the consequences: Margaret. And Ethan knew the final chapter was waiting ahead. Margaret realized she had lost the moment her lawyers stopped calling her back. There was no formal rejection, no legal letter, only a prolonged silence, thick and cold, the kind of silence that those who once controlled others understand very well. Ethan did not need to appear to apply pressure. He only needed to stand still, and the entire system collapsed on its own. Margaret sat alone in her small apartment, her phone resting on the table, sunlight cutting across her face and revealing the cracks left by time and strain. She called a third law office that week. The call lasted less than a minute. The voice on the other end was polite, cautious, and firm. No one wanted to take this case. She knew why. The rumors had spread. No documents were needed, no statements. Just a whisper in the right place. Evidence gathered improperly. Invasion of privacy. Illegal recordings. What had once been considered a counterattack had now become a liability no one wanted to touch. Margaret understood that Ethan had done the most dangerous thing possible. He did not strike. He made others retreat on their own. On the other side of the city, Ethan sat in Daniel's office quietly signing the final documents. Not to sue, but to close the door. Short, precise papers that sealed every legal path that could be exploited in the future. Daniel looked at him with a mixture of respect and caution. He said he rarely saw someone handle betrayal this way, without noise, without revenge, but absolutely. Ethan only nodded. He did not feel victorious. He felt aligned. That afternoon, Margaret appeared outside Daniel's office without an appointment. She demanded to see Ethan. Daniel refused. She pleaded. Then she grew angry. Finally, she became desperate. Daniel's tone never changed. He said all communication must be in writing, and that Ethan was under no obligation to listen to anything further. Margaret stood for a long time in front of the glass doors, then turned away, her back more hunched than before, her steps slower. There was no one left to blame, no one left to negotiate with. The game she had started ended without inviting her to the final round. That evening, Ethan returned home alone. No familiar sounds, no perfume, no staged presence. He walked through each room, turning lights on and then off, not to search, but to confirm that no one was watching anymore. He stopped in his father's study. Everything was unchanged. The bookshelf, the wooden desk, the old photo frame. Ethan sat in the familiar chair and felt true silence for the first time in months. No tension, no suspicion. Just space returned to its rightful owner. His phone vibrated. A message from Olivia. Not long, not pleading. She said she had done exactly what he asked. She had signed the documents. She had cut all contact. And she would be leaving the city. Ethan read it and did not reply right away. Some endings do not need a goodbye. The next day, Daniel called. His voice was lighter. The file was officially closed. No lawsuit, no courtroom, but also no way back for anyone who had crossed the line. Margaret would have no access to the assets, no legal footing, no leverage. Ethan thanked him and ended the call. That afternoon, he drove out of the city. No specific destination, just space. The road stretched ahead, sunlight even and calm, no longer the feeling of being watched from behind. He realized something simple. Real power is not the ability to hurt others. It is the ability to ensure no one can hurt you again. As the sun set, Ethan pulled over, stepped out, and breathed deeply. There was no climax, no applause. Only peace, late but earned. The conflict was over. Not with blood, not with tears, but with clarity. And this time Ethan was no longer underestimated, no longer guided by others. He stood firmly within his own story, and no one else had the right to write it for him. The message arrived on a morning when Ethan believed everything had finally settled, and a single short line was enough to ripple the surface of what had just grown calm. Margaret wanted to talk one last time. Not through lawyers, no paperwork, just a direct meeting. Ethan read it, set the phone down, and stared out the window for a long moment. He was not surprised. People who once believed they held control always need a final moment to convince themselves they have not lost completely. Ethan agreed. not out of curiosity, but for closure. The meeting took place at a small cafe on the edge of the city, a place with no familiar faces, no shared memories, no stage for drama. Margaret arrived early. She sat upright, hands resting on the table, like someone preparing to step into the final hearing of her life. When Ethan appeared, she stood. No hug, no handshake, just a nod. Margaret spoke first. She said she had lost everything. Lawyers, leverage, influence. She said she never thought things would go this far, that at the beginning she only wanted recognition, wanted to be seen as someone who once helped build a life, even if that life had fallen apart. Ethan listened without interrupting or pushing back. He realized something. Margaret had not come to threaten him. She had come to justify herself. She spoke about the years after the divorce, about the feeling of being pushed aside, about watching Ethan move on and remain steady while she stayed trapped by her own choices. Her voice trembled but was not weak. It was the voice of someone long accustomed to blaming circumstances. Ethan waited until she stopped. Then he spoke. He said he did not deny her pain, but he would not accept that pain as an excuse to invade someone else's life. He said there are boundaries that cannot be crossed, no matter how complicated the past may be. Margaret looked at him for the first time without defense and asked whether he had ever loved her. The question hung in the air like a dry leaf. Ethan did not answer immediately. He considered it, then spoke the truth. He said he had once, but love does not survive when it is used as a tool, and that the refusal to let go had turned memory into a burden. Margaret lowered her head slowly. She admitted that hiring Olivia had been wrong, that she had convinced herself the ends justified the means, that she never thought Ethan would see through it so quickly. Ethan said he did not see through it because he was smarter. He saw it because his father taught him one thing. When someone tries to take what does not belong to them, they leave traces, and his only task was patience. Margaret smiled sadly. She said perhaps that was why Ethan had always been underestimated. People thought he did not notice when in reality he was simply waiting. The conversation ended without a formal apology, without a new agreement, only with a late acknowledgement that all doors had closed. Margaret stood first slowly, as if each step placed a piece of the past back where it belonged. Ethan stayed a while longer, drinking his now cold coffee, watching strangers pass by. No one knew who he was. No one knew he had just closed a long chapter of betrayal and calculation. In the afternoon, Ethan returned home. He opened the windows and let the light pour in. There was no longer any sense of being watched, no unanswered questions hanging in the air, only real space. He took out a stack of blank paper and placed it on his desk. Not to write lawsuits, not to document evidence, just to begin writing what he wanted for the rest of his life. Not revenge, not victory, but choice. This chapter was about to close, and Ethan knew the most important thing was not what he had lost, but who he had kept. Himself. Everything seemed finished until one final detail emerged quietly, yet powerful enough to overturn every remaining emotion. Ethan received a thin envelope delivered to his home early that morning. No return address, no note. Only an old office seal he recognized instantly. He opened it slowly, as if unwilling to disturb the silence he had only just learned to trust. Inside was a copy of a supplementary will written by his father many years earlier, one that had never been publicly disclosed. Ethan read every line, every word, and finally understood the deeper reason behind everything. His father had not only prepared to protect the assets, he had prepared to protect his son from those who would underestimate him. In that document was a separate clause, written in simple yet sharp language, stating that power only has meaning when the one who holds it is clear-minded enough not to abuse it, and that if the day ever came When Ethan had to end a betrayal with his own hands, his father trusted that his son would choose the path that caused the least harm to himself. Ethan closed the envelope. There was no anger, no tears. Only the feeling of being seen, of being understood, even if it came late. He stepped outside and let the morning light touch his face. The city was still noisy. People were still rushing. No one knew a silent war had just ended, and no one knew how underestimated the man standing among them had once been. Ethan returned to his work without display, without announcements, yet every decision he made now carried more certainty and clarity. Those who once doubted him adjusted the way they spoke. Those who once believed he did not notice now avoided his gaze, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Late one evening, Ethan sat alone in the living room, the main lights off a single soft glow, enough to see without glare. He thought about Olivia, about Margaret, about the earlier versions of himself who had stayed silent too long, believing silence was safety. He realized something simple and profound. Silence is only safe when others do not use it to invade. When boundaries are crossed, silence is no longer an option. Clarity is the answer. Ethan opened the window and let the night air flow in. There was no sense of loss, no unanswered questions, only the complete ending of one cycle and the beginning of another one, where he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The next morning, Ethan cleaned his study. He discarded old files and copies, once kept as shields. They were no longer needed. What he kept were blank pages, new plans, choices made from real freedom. He understood that true power is not controlling others. It is controlling oneself, not reacting to provocation, not acting from fear, but from clarity. As the sun rose higher, Ethan locked the door, stepped outside and smiled faintly. Not the smile of a victor, but the smile of someone who had walked out of a story that no longer belonged to him. If you stayed with Ethan until this moment, perhaps you have also experienced being underestimated, misunderstood, or silently betrayed. Share your story in the comments, because sometimes speaking at the right moment is the first step toward reclaiming your own power. If this story made you reflect, press like and subscribe so you do not miss the journeys ahead, where truth always finds a way to surface, and those who remain clear-minded are the ones who get to rewrite the ending.